Legion of the Chimera will bring about a new age of peace, tolerance, and equality for all. Even you must agree that such a true and noble goal surely justifies whatever means necessary to bring it about.
Icewind Dale 2 is a real-time with pause hack-and-slash computer role-playing game, developed by Black Isle Studios and published by Interplay Entertainment in August 2002. The civilized northern frontier of Faerun is once again at the mercy of monstrous forces, so players must save the day by creating a party of 6 adventurers to stab, spiel, and steal their way across the frozen spine of the world. Like the first game, Icewind Dale 2 is based on the advanced Dungeons & Dragons pen and paper rule set, but this time adapting the 3rd edition of the game to provide new classes, new races, and hundreds of new skills and special abilities. Black Isle promised to amaze Icewind Dale fans with a longer, more challenging campaign, a new user interface, scripted events that would push the Infinity Engine to its limits, smarter AI, and hordes of fearsome new enemies. The game was released to strong sales and relatively positive reviews, though the average critical score was slightly below that of the original. Most critics lauded Icewind Dale 2 as a throwback to classic dungeon crawling experiences, praising the unrelenting level of difficulty, environmental and portrait art, and addictive gameplay. Some critics were less flattering of the game's challenge, arguing it made the experience less accessible or even downright tedious. As with reviews of the first game, some reviewers also felt Icewind Dale 2's focus on action over story and role-playing held it back, and several complained that the series was starting to feel stale by 2002. Finally, reviewers were almost universally critical of the aging Infinity Engine, with complaints about bugs, poor performance, and shoddy AI pathfinding appearing in nearly every review. Even PC Gamer's mostly positive review of the game likened it to a reheated burrito. Despite the game's success, it was unable to reverse Interplay Entertainment's legal and financial woes, and over the course of 2002 and 2003 there was an exodus of many key personnel. Black Isle was shut down at the end of 2003, and though many alumni would eventually find their way to former Black Isle head Fergus Urquhart's Obsidian Entertainment, the Icewind Dale series died with the studio.
The circumstances surrounding the development of Icewind Dale 2 were not really ideal.
Mid-2001 saw Black Isle reeling from the cancellation of Torn, an ambitious project from the Planescape Torment team that was intended as an amalgam of the role-playing mechanics of Fallout and the fully 3D gameplay of the Lithtech engine. The project had been a costly, stressful, and time-consuming failure that culminated in layoffs at both Black Isle and Associated Studios. For Black Isle to survive, it needed a low-risk slam dunk to mitigate its losses. Icewind Dale 2 was to be that game. The title was originally given a ludicrously short 2 to 4 month development window, with the intention of using the modified AD&D 2nd edition rules from Icewind Dale and slapping some 3rd edition features on top. For example, the original intention was to jerry-rig Baldur's Gate 2's kit system to simulate the 3rd edition subclasses. Some of the development team, including the original project lead, actually quit, since it looked like the project was a disaster in the making. Josh Sawyer stepped in with his own ideas for the project.
It was funny because Josh came to me, Josh Sawyer came to me when we were working on Icewind Dale 2, and it was still 2nd edition D&D. And he came, he says, he was talking to Darren, right? And that was it. And then Darren warned me that Josh was going to try to convince me to make it 3rd edition. I'm pretty sure that's how it went. And I'm like, and I was like, okay, that was crazy.
The team was surprised to discover that converting to 3rd edition rules wouldn't be the nightmare they expected, and development was given an extension of several months for a late summer 2002 release. But this apparent lifeline for the team brought its own set of challenges. Since the original, deliberately conservative outline for the game was based around a frenzied 4-month rush to completion, the team had difficulty designing around the longer 10-month development cycle. In 2006, Josh Sawyer said of the experience, "It was less of a death march and more of a death race. I felt like I wasn't exactly leading people as much as shooting them out of cannons in a general direction." Aside from Sawyer, the team were a mix of Icewind Dale, Fallout, and Planescape veterans. Sawyer himself had to leave the project partway through to take over duties on another Black Isle title, leaving Chris Avallone and Dave Maldonado to finish his areas. A few key figures from the original Icewind Dale team had also fallen by the wayside. Artist Jason Manley had left Black Isle, and composer Jeremy Soule was unavailable due to scheduling conflicts. But it was the Planescape team, some coming off the cancelled Torn project, that faced particular difficulties with Icewind Dale 2. Though both Planescape Torment and Icewind Dale were forks of the original Infinity engine, the Planescape engine had been heavily modified to accommodate advanced scripting and engine enhancements. Some of these features were not possible on the Icewind Dale engine, and developers struggled to realise their original plans for certain areas. Sawyer would later cite Fell Wood and the Black Raven Monastery as pale imitations of their original vision, having been designed around mechanics that could not be properly implemented. Even in those areas in which the team was able to smack the engine into shape, the process was extremely hard on both developers and the engine's stability, to the extent that sequences like some of those in the Ice Temple and Dragon's Eye were, in technical language, held together by duct tape and glue. When speaking of his time on Icewind Dale 2, Josh Sawyer once lamented, "I am not proud of any of the games I've worked on, so it's not surprising that people conclude I'm incompetent from looking at my work." By the time of Pillars of Eternity, Sawyer's memories of the project had apparently become less traumatic, and though he still felt the game needed more polish, he added that, "Overall, I think Icewind Dale 2 turned out pretty good, pretty fun, and for making it in 10 months, pretty great." The basic gameplay loop in Icewind Dale 2 is similar to the first game. Build your party, embark on your quest, slaughter your enemies and strip their corpses, level your characters up, go sell off your loot, and set out on your next objective. Darren Monahan said that with Icewind Dale 2, they wanted to bring back the experience of Icewind Dale, but at the same time address its shortcomings, by adding more puzzles, more character options, and more inventive and varied combat encounters. But returning players will register some other significant changes in 3 key areas: the underlying mechanics, the execution, and the overall pacing of the game. Black Isle's adaptation of AD&D 3rd edition won't seem completely alien to Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale veterans, but there are some important differences. Upon firing up character creation, the first thing they'll notice is obviously the new sub-races and subclasses, all with their own little advantages or disadvantages, like having immunities to certain status effects, but suffering a small debuff from daylight, or gaining stat bonuses, but leveling more slowly than normal. None of this is too radical for Infinity Engine games. But the class system itself is a little different in Icewind Dale 2. Classes are a lot more flexible, with the game actively encouraging a certain level of experimentation by dipping into different classes when leveling up. Many class restrictions, like limiting spellcasters to specific weapon types, have been loosened or removed completely. Some abilities or statistics that were previously governed by a character's class are now part of a character's skills. For example, the ability to use stealth has been decoupled from the thief or ranger classes, and is instead governed by the hide skill, which almost any character can put points into. Similarly, characters with the ability to cast spells will likely want to invest points in the concentration skill to prevent their spells from fizzling if they take damage during combat. The new feats system is probably a bit more exciting to the average player than the skills are. It can range from choosing to get a tiny health boost or passive damage bonuses, to more active abilities like being able to use different types of melee attacks. Many of these feats have prerequisites, like a minimum dexterity score, and others are automatically granted to certain classes or sub-races, but they do allow a lot of extra customization. There might be 3 different sword and shield fighters in a player's party, but all of them excelling at holding off different types of enemies, based on the feats chosen for them. Despite all this, classes are certainly still very relevant to what kind of role you want a character to play. They're not completely absent like in Fallout, or mere guidelines like in the later Elder Scrolls games. If you want a frontline damage dealer for your party, it's probably best to pick a fighter who will automatically be proficient with, and can eventually master, most weapon types. If you want a support character, it's probably best to pick a cleric, who can turn undead and convert some of their spells into heals in the heat of battle. In short, the class system is a bit less restrictive and allows for more unique character specializations, but it's also riskier for players, as more options means exponentially more opportunities to create a suboptimal character by investing points in the wrong place, such as in bluff. One of the most interesting things about Icewind Dale 2's skills is that many of them are not directly related to a character's combat abilities. Points can be invested into skills like diplomacy, bluffing, intimidation, or alchemy. Of all the Infinity Engine games, it's actually Icewind Dale 2 that features by far the most instances of stat or skill checks for dialogue options or non-combat actions. Coaxing information and bonus experience out of enemies, sweet-talking peers, tricking guards, mixing potions, it's all here. Other titles certainly had a few dialogues that recognised a character's class, race and stats, but even after putting them all together, they're dwarfed by how many of these there are in Icewind Dale 2. In fact, there are so many of these that I noticed quite a few errors in online walkthroughs for the game, failing to note certain fights that could be avoided, or mislabeling which stats and skills were being checked. This isn't a criticism of those walkthroughs, as it's extremely difficult to work out everything that's happening behind the scenes in these dialogues, without resorting to modding tools. Now, this isn't Fallout or Arcanum, and there are some weaknesses to these dialogue checks, but we'll come back to this in the role-playing section of the video.
Nope. I never heard of it.
Another noticeable change to character creation is the loss of stat rolls. Previously, players would roll for randomized stats, and then adjust the results to their liking. In Icewind Dale 2, a new character has their stats set to their base values, and the player distributes the free points as they see fit, with extra points every few levels. This obviously makes more sense than the old system, though it does disadvantage role players who liked to work around the random strengths and weaknesses of their character, as well as people like me who enjoyed the metagaming aspect of trying to get the max roll for strength on their melee fighters. Speaking of fighting, one of the big talking points Black Isle used for the new 3rd edition rules was the change to armor class and Thaco. Without getting into the numbers, in the Infinity Engine games, by lowering a character's armor class, the player made them better at avoiding physical damage. And the two most relevant numbers affecting armor class were a character's dexterity and the armor they wore. Higher dexterity and better armor resulted in a lower armor class, and enchanted gear might have a bonus to AC, which meant they lowered it. Now, the actual formula for this is a bit more complicated, but all you really needed to know was that you wanted a negative AC. Some players disliked this system, feeling it was unintuitive to be chasing bonuses that lowered a stat. Not to mention the whole concept of heavy armor lowering the chance of being hit, rather than reducing the effect of being hit. So, in Icewind Dale 2, bonuses to armor class raise your AC, which seems simple enough. However, armors also have a maximum dexterity bonus, which means the AC bonuses received from a high dexterity are limited by the type of armor worn. In effect, this means that one armor might have a better armor bonus than another lighter armor, but the lighter armor might have a higher maximum dexterity bonus to armor class. Thus, the heavier armor might not benefit your overall AC. And of course, there are plenty of special or enchanted armors in the game that not only have a higher AC bonus than the standard versions of those armors, but also a higher or lower maximum dexterity bonus to AC. And let's not forget, there are different classes of armor class. There were not only armor bonuses, but also shield bonuses, deflection bonuses, and generic bonuses. Some of these bonuses did not stack, which meant if you, say, had 2 items that improved your deflection bonus, only the highest value item would be used. But some of these bonuses did stack with each other, usually spell or bardic bonuses to armor class. So there were further levels of complication to this system that probably outweighed the supposed simplification of AC, making the whole thing rather confusing to players who didn't quite grasp how things work in 3rd edition AD&D. And God help those players when they finish Icewind Dale 2's prologue chapter.
I know that some people did jump in and they got rocked.
I don't think it's controversial to call Icewind Dale 2 one of the most difficult Infinity Engine games. In Icewind Dale, a pack of goblins and a cave of orc raiders led by a shaman and ogre helped filter out badly designed or poorly prepared players within the first 20 minutes of starting the game. But in Icewind Dale 2, new parties are given a comparatively gentle welcome to the game by Chris Avallone, who designed the town of Targos. Once out of character creation, the party just has to deal with a few disorganised goblins scavenging around the map. And once those are dealt with, there's a lengthy period of calm in which the players will focus on fetch quests and dialogue, without too much to endanger them. There's a slight difficulty bump at the climax of the chapter, but it's not too demanding. But then players will start Chapter 1. Granted, I didn't build the perfect party, but from reading other people's impressions, it seems there's a general consensus that the game's difficulty ramps up considerably here, and continues to brutalise the player right up until somewhere around the end of the chapter, or the early stages of Chapter 2. For the rest of the game, the level of challenge seems to shoot up and down spasmodically. I honestly found most of Chapter 1 infinitely more difficult than any of the endgame fights, including the optional ones. Sawyer has defended the difficulty curve in Icewind Dale 2 by arguing that anyone still interested in the Infinity Engine games in 2002 was a hardcore player and veteran of the series. This is probably half true, but it misses the fact that the earlier titles had an ebb and flow to the pacing of combat encounters. There were intense, set-piece battles, but there were also periods in which more mundane encounters were meant to probe your party's defences, or wear at their resources, like poisonous or diseased enemies, or creatures that could inflict long-term status debuffs. It was assumed that the party were not always going to be at their best, so even less dangerous foes like thugs or hobgoblins could catch a wounded party off guard. At certain points in Icewind Dale 2, it feels like Black Isle's response to criticisms about balancing party resting and save scumming was to throw in the towel and design encounters under the assumption that players would always rest and restock between encounters. This really damages the pacing in some areas, as it feels less like the party going on an adventure, and more like the party is taking refreshment breaks between a series of Colosseum fights. The fact the game scales experience points based on the party's average level just rubs salt in the wound, as even as the players start to grow tired of fighting the same enemies, they'll also witness their rewards for overcoming these fights dwindling away to nothing. I'd rather Black Isle had evened out the difficulty curve and imposed more restrictions on resting in combat areas, or at least added some consequences to resting near enemies, like letting them receive reinforcements every 8 hours or something. There are a couple of points at which a half-hearted attempt is made at this, but it doesn't last very long and it relies on some rather lazy tricks, like just spawning enemies out of thin air, regardless of the party's tracking and spot skills, or detection spells. As it stands, the length and enemy count of the game work against it, and can make the adventure a bit of a slog. But it's not only the difficulty level that contributes to this problem. Sawyer has repeatedly admitted that Icewind Dale 2 as a whole needed more polish, cutting superfluous content and folding certain areas into one another to make the remaining areas feel more varied and less drawn out. 3 areas that attracted particularly harsh criticism were the Horde Warrens, the Ice Temple, and Dragon's Eye. On paper, these areas have a great level of variety in enemy encounters, puzzles, and NPC interaction. But from a ground level perspective, many players agreed content here was spread too thinly and poorly paced. The Horde Warrens are mostly just one unimaginative fight after another. The mostly optional battle square in the already lengthy Ice Temple feels more like it belongs in one of the old Final Fantasies as endgame side content, and it's maddeningly easy for enemies to break the scripting in this area. Dragon's Eye really tests the player's patience. It's a multi-level dungeon full of the exact same enemies as the player has been fighting for the past few hours, and it culminates in a time loop that forces the players to repeat an area over and over again until they figure out how to escape it. And just to twist the knife a little, these areas are meticulously laid out to demonstrate how appallingly bad the AI pathfinding is. Party members will constantly take the most insanely circuitous routes to their destination, walk down side corridors into traps and enemies, and wander off in the opposite direction during combat. I'm fairly certain the actual pathfinding algorithms are no worse than Baldur's Gate 2 or Icewind Dale, but the maps seem to be built in such a way as to exacerbate the problem. In any case, most of these areas probably sounded fine on paper. The Horde Warrens have a few side quests and non-combat solutions depending on your party. The Ice Temple has a bunch of NPCs and puzzles. The final level of Dragon's Eye has some very inventive traps, and the time loop could have been a really interesting theatrical murder mystery. Had these areas been more condensed, they could have held up to Durlag's Tower, or at least Watcher's Keep. This is probably why, for example, Dr. J's review of Icewind Dale 2 praised the prologue and especially the final chapter, which aren't stretched as thinly as the aforementioned problem areas. I agree that the last area has a great balance of dialogue, side quests, and set-piece battles, although I did find these fights, especially the final bosses, a little underwhelming, and I wished the game had pulled something out of its hat to really surprise players. Now, sure, we always think a game would be better if it had just had that couple of extra months of development time. But it's so frustrating to play Icewind Dale 2 knowing that its biggest shortcomings weren't really in its core design, just issues that could have been solved with a few more passes for streamlining and pacing. The Infinity Engine games are well known for their distinct sprite work, evocative character portraits, and picturesque pre-rendered background art. Icewind Dale 2 is no exception, with Black Isle premiering dozens of new monsters alongside hundreds of new items and environments. There are a handful of instances in which corners had to be cut, like using bald gnomes in cosplay to represent half-goblins. But for the most part, the new art is excellent, and looks fine alongside the assets from earlier games. Personally, I particularly liked the menacing armoured clerics, and the regal half-dragons, plus all the cool new goblin types. Some reviewers were critical of Black Isle recycling environments from the first Icewind Dale, and there are a few places where the new and the old art styles don't quite gel. Plus a few instances of some sloppy tile set boundaries that can make navigation a little awkward. A couple of old reviews also complained that there was, well, too much snow in Icewind Dale. I was more bothered by the abundance of caverns and rather mundane military camps, which made me miss the dwarven stonework of the first game.
Agreed.
Another very subjective issue I had with the background art was that it seemed colder than the original, almost like there was a post-processing filter that washed out the colours. Another obvious departure from previous titles is the new user interface. In an interview with XGR, Josh Sawyer said at the time that this requirement had been passed along by Interplay's QA department.
They've been working on a lot of Infinity Engine games, and we had questions for them like, after all this time, the Infinity Engine, is there anything that you feel could be changed to make it feel new and refreshing and would make your playing experience more enjoyable? And a lot of them said they would just like it if the interface were changed to be upgraded.
The idea behind the new UI was that it would be more immersive due to taking up less real estate. and that it would be easier for players to find important information about their characters. Unfortunately, I think it falls short for a few reasons. Firstly, seeing more of the environment doesn't necessarily make the game more immersive. This isn't a twitchy first-person shooter where a greater field of view is going to give a significant tactical advantage. When I was ambushed by off-screen enemies in Icewind Dale 2, they were usually coming from the north or south, rather than the sides of the screen. In terms of the immersion argument, so long as the user interface feels like it fits in the world, it doesn't matter how many layers of abstraction there are between the player and the characters inhabiting that world. Here's the old horseshoe UI, with your party nestled in the warm embrace of its skeuomorphic walls. And here's the Icewind Dale 2 one. Can you, in good conscience, justify exposing your party to the elements like this? This is one of the reasons there was such a backlash to the Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition UI, especially once they replaced it with the completely inappropriate Siege of Dragonspear version. UI art might seem like a very minor criticism, but when the old UI fit the world so perfectly, messing with that can be as bad as screwing up a character's face or something. From the perspective of functionality, Icewind Dale 2's UI is actually a bit of a downgrade compared to the old system. The menu buttons on the original UI communicate their role very clearly. Here's the journal. Here's the inventory. Here's the character screen. And here's the spells. Icewind Dale's is essentially the same. At worst, I suppose a new player might mix up the spellbook and priest scroll. But Icewind Dale 2's is terrible. How are you supposed to distinguish between the journal, spellbook, and character sheet buttons? I was still misclicking things even during the final battle. At least Planescape's UI had the courtesy to be color-coded for idiots. I don't think compartmentalizing the character sheet was a downgrade exactly, but I don't think it was particularly helpful either. When it comes to the Infinity Engine games, a major problem for new players isn't so much finding information about their characters and gear, but understanding what that information actually represents and how it all fits together. If Black Isle really wanted to overhaul the UI, I think pop-ups for an in-game manual or encyclopedia would have been more useful. Like the other games, sound design is very strong, and environments seem to feature more ambient sound than Icewind Dale. Unfortunately, the background NPCs themselves are still mute, so even when strolling through a traveller community with small children milling about, the audio environment sounds a bit distant, since, unlike in Baldur's Gate, none of the sounds are coming from the NPCs themselves.
I need some help.
Instead, the voice acting budget seems to have been pumped into the main quest NPCs. You'll recognise one or two names here, like Peter Stromara.
You there, draw near. I would speak with you.
Or Earl Bowen.
Whoever you are, if you want to serve Targos, then you'd best have brought me word of what's happening at the docks.
Although there are no weak links in the cast, I'm not sure if the extra voice acting content really adds anything to the experience. How much did it really add to have this entire paragraph voice acted?
Oswald has reported that the trail to Shanegarn is choked with goblin troops. His suggestion, and I agree, is that a small party might be able to make its way up the frozen river to the bridge and take the enemy forces by surprise.
It would have been better to restrict voice acting to a few key lines delivered with maximum hamminess.
Every crime must be punished.
And spread the rest of the VA budget more evenly. Thankfully, there are a few new voice packs for your party alongside the ones from Icewind Dale and its expansions. I especially liked the new drow ones.
Ask politely, or you die.
Ustar ilindith, za usta ilindith.
Reviewers had mixed opinions on Inonzer's score. Some declared it equal to or better than Jeremy Soul's work on Icewind Dale, some of which is reused in Icewind Dale 2's cutscenes, but others considered it a letdown. It's a little unfair to compare the two, since Soul had a chance to work on both Icewind Dale and Heart of Winter, whereas Zer was only composing enough for one game. My feelings lean towards Soul's work being superior. Here's an excerpt of the main theme for Icewind Dale. And here's the Icewind Dale 2 version. Maybe Zer was aiming for a bit more of a diegetic score, like in the besieged Targos, where he uses blaring horns and war trumpets to put the player on edge. But I didn't really bother listening to the Icewind Dale 2 soundtrack outside the game. I actually found it relatively easy to find appropriate music for my Icewind Dale review, thanks to tracks like the opening cutscene music, East Haven, Kuldahar, the Mage Tower, Lonelywood, and so on. But it was a real struggle to match music to this video. The Docks, Targos Town, and a cover of an Icewind Dale 1 track were the only ones that really worked for me. I don't think Inonzer did a bad job with the Icewind Dale 2 soundtrack. I just think if you compare it to, let's say, his work on Fallout 4, I think he's come a long way as a composer, especially when it comes to ambient music. So, overall, contrary to the reviews, I don't think Icewind Dale 2 suffered that much from being made in the Infinity engine. As with the gameplay, I think anyone interested in the game got more or less what they were expecting. If technology held the game back at all, it was in its bugginess. For the past few years, the GOG version of the game has been packaged with a fan-made direct draw replacement, which should solve most of the graphical problems people on newer hardware had been dealing with. Unfortunately, it can't fix the problems arising from Black Isle pushing the engine too hard for the sake of gimmicks. "30 years after the events of the first game, the North quails to the march of an endless horde of goblinoids who have poured from across the spine of the world, united under the banner of the three-headed Chimera. As the civilized 10 towns burn, the besieged port of Targos begs its southern neighbors to aid them before the entire region falls beneath this chimeric legion. An army of mercenaries set sail from Luskan to liberate Icewind Dale, but are ambushed and annihilated. A handful of survivors limp into Targos, our heroes among them. Like in the original game, it's the player who determines the nature of Icewind Dale 2's protagonists. None of your party have any preset personalities or relationships to anything in the world of Faerun. Black Isle does offer the option of a few preset adventuring parties this time around, with their background stories already written, but these are more like creative writing prompts for the player's imagination. None of these characters are actually of their own mind. If building your party from scratch, it's a good idea to put some thought into the dynamics of their relationships, and their motivations for being there. As once you begin the game, you won't receive any feedback from them regarding how they feel about what's happening or the decisions made by the party leader. For role-playing purposes, I'd recommend including at least one party member from an atypical subrace, like a tiefling, half-orc, drow, dwergar, or swerfneblin. These add a little flavour to some of your encounters, since NPCs might have unique reactions to them, or you might gain some extra dialogue options relating to their heritage or racial abilities. Although I loved the fact that the game sometimes acknowledges these things about your character, they are mostly fluff. The ability to speak goblinoid or demonic languages, for example, is actually a lot less useful than you might expect. A critical problem, though, is the fact that race and skill checks will typically only be triggered by the specific party member interacting with that NPC or item. So, a paladin might refuse to accept a monetary reward from starving peasants, but won't care if the half-demon thief in their party accepts it on their behalf. Meanwhile, an NPC might chat with one member of your party as if they were old friends, but try to murder them if the party member standing next to them spoke instead. First of all, this encourages save scumming and metagaming, but equally important is the fact that it misses an opportunity for your party members to define themselves as individuals. In Baldur's Gate, your party members might comment on their surroundings, chime in with their own opinions, or in extreme cases turn against you.
Go for the eyes, fool! Go for the eyes!
But in Icewind Dale 2, the party are just meat puppets. They might as well be golems. The most personality you'll get out of the heroes in Icewind Dale 2 is from clicking them enough to make their voice actors break character.
I sure do love me them spiders.
Obviously, there are some players who don't care about story or role-playing and just want to kill things, in which case they can create whatever party they think most effective and not worry about the rest. And I understand you're the primary demographic for the Icewind Dale series. I just thought it strange that Black Isle put all that work into the race and skill checks, but still cut themselves off at the knees. At the start of the game, your party's goal is to purge Targos of goblin infiltrators, and then help the town beat back the besieging forces. But it quickly becomes clear that the Legion of the Chimera is far more than an army of rampaging goblins, and the hero's only chance of saving Icewind Dale is to shatter this dark alliance and then strike at the heart of the Legion. Once the party embarks upon this extended adventure, you'll find that the story is somewhat less anchored than Icewind Dale's, in the sense that though the party would be away from civilization for extended periods in the first game, they would always eventually return to one of the two main quest hubs. In Icewind Dale 2, the party will spend a lot longer away from such hubs, even losing access to them after certain milestones, instead relying on a number of rather conveniently located wandering merchants strung along their path. It's a shame Black Isle didn't return to the formula they used for Lonelywood in Heart of Winter, where there was only one distinct quest hub, but it would sometimes evolve with the adventurers, so that the party would sometimes return to the town and find that a new crisis had developed. I assume the intention for abandoning this was to make Icewind Dale 2's expedition feel more like an epic journey across the spine of the world. At the end of the tale, the narrator talks about how recounting the party's story has inspired her to go on her own adventure, but personally I didn't share her feelings. I know it's unfair to compare concluding the entire Baldur's Gate saga with this game, but even Heart of Winter's ending moved me more than Icewind Dale 2's. Tonally, there are two major differences between Icewind Dale and Icewind Dale 2's writing. The first is that Icewind Dale 2 injects a little bit more humour into proceedings. Targos is full of lots of little in-jokes about less experienced mercenaries being forced to do fetch quests, or an NPC's boundary box blocking a container, or how the town's defences are built to take advantage of the goblins' bad pathfinding. This kind of meta-humour is very risky, as it can undermine the player's belief in the reality of the setting. There's nothing worse than when satire or self-indulgent pastiche is used as a band-aid for bad writing. Fortunately, Icewind Dale 2 doesn't go too far in this direction. The other departure from Icewind Dale is in its portrayal of the antagonists. Icewind Dale depicted the struggle against evil in terms of black and white morality. The antagonists were usually monsters, madmen, or malicious opportunists. Heart of Winter flirted with a more nuanced perspective on the struggle between civilization and barbarism, and whether there was a moral imperative to preserve a species or culture. But in Icewind Dale 2, the nature of your enemies and the merit of their cause is a bit more of an open question. Very early on in the game, you'll start to encounter foes who justify their actions as acts of resistance against oppression or persecution. After dealing with the goblin hordes, it becomes increasingly obvious that many of those involved in the Legion are outcasts or exiles, and many of these are the offspring of unusual biracial pairings.
In unimaginable greatness, I am a dragon, but in irrevocable shame, I'm also human.
Sometimes your enemies have joined the opposing faction because it's brought them protection or a sense of belonging, or were drawn into the struggle due to their bonds with another character.
And were my sisters not defending their selves, their home, my home?
In other cases, your enemies claim to be motivated by political goals, arguing that they and those like them will only find safety in a sort of fantasy ethno-state for exotic half-breeds.
We're a nation of outcasts and hybrids that your kind fears, judges, and banishes to your slave pits, dungeons, and sanctuaries. A new world is dawning, and all of Faerun will soon have little choice but to recognize.
Chapter 5 of the game especially gives a lot of background information on the Legion's rulers and how the war with the 10 towns originally came about.
They are forged from evil, and nothing but evil can come from them. I remember telling her that. Did we make it so?
How convincing the player finds these arguments is debatable. Obviously, we won't get into the thorny real-life analogies, but approaching a fantasy story in this way causes a lot of problems. First of all, ethnic or racial definitions in the game's setting are not cultural or sociological, but incontestable reality. If you are a half-orc in Faerun, you are biologically predisposed to be stronger, stupider, and more prone to violence than a halfling. If you're a tiefling, your corrupted demon blood will affect your natural talents, your mood, and your character traits. If you are a female elf, your greatest ambition in life is that I don't really know anything about how alignment works in modern Dungeons and Dragons, but being lectured on morality by a devious, backstabbing, murderous, man-eating doppelganger is pretty absurd. Moreover, the Legion's actions don't really leave much room for interpretation. Their allies are overwhelmingly made up of monsters, demons, or followers of evil-aligned gods. This axis of evil engages in slavery, mass murder, pillaging, forced breeding and eugenics programs, experimentation on live prisoners, and negligence towards pets. Specific individuals in the Legion are just as bad. No matter how much of a tearjerker their tragic backstory, they're still cartoonishly evil figures, murdering slaves and underlings at a whim. I did like that some of these characters were brought back from Icewind Dale, which gives a sense of a coherent Icewind Dale franchise universe. But a lot of these characters are brought back and then discarded rather cheaply. Subverting standard fantasy morality was hardly novel in 2002, even in video games. So I'm not sure what the intent behind all this was, beyond Sawyer's explanation that they were written to be antagonists. There's no inherent virtue in muddling a story's morality if you're not really going to go anywhere with it. You can give villains depth without telling the player they were bullied as children. In the Goblin Warrens, for example, you can convince some of the rival goblinoids that they'd find easier sport attacking their own neighbours rather than waging war against civilization. In the same vein, I do think Icewind Dale 2's main antagonists are better than the first games, but that's mostly just because they're introduced earlier and given a bit more characterization, not because they had a hard childhood. In theory, the Legion's motivations might resonate with certain party members, particularly tieflings or half-orcs, who are usually treated poorly by mainstream society in Faerun. But since your party members have so few opportunities to assert themselves, and the main thrust of the story is so linear, this doesn't amount to anything. I remember when I first played the game at release, I was convinced it was all leading up to having multiple endings, and I dumped a lot of skill points into the diplomacy and bluff skills, on the assumption that these were modelled on the non-violent options in Planescape Torment and Arcanum. Obviously, I won't spoil Icewind Dale 2's ending, but it's exactly what you'd expect from a typical fantasy story. Even if the events of the ending were predestined, there could have been a more tragic or bittersweet tone to the final cutscene to make it feel more profound.
My head won't fit in the root jar.
Yes, Marilee, that's very interesting. I told her that her head was too small for her age. Now she tries to fit her head in everything.
I've always played Icewind Dale 2 without any extra features beyond the official patches and direct draw fix, but the game features all the usual fan content you'd expect for an Infinity Engine title. There's the widescreen mod, of course, though you'll need an extra fix for this and it can still cause the game to crash at a specific point. You've also got the various tweak packs or fan patches that fix some item and ability bugs and restore some minor cut content. Due to some changes to the way the UI handles portraits and sound packs, you won't just be able to drag and drop your custom portraits from other games into Icewind Dale 2, although fixing this yourself isn't too much work. In terms of tinkering behind the scenes, there are some mods rebalancing items and spells, or removing the level scaling that affected experience points gains. As far as more substantial content goes, Waidu's Undead Targos was one of the earliest big mods for Icewind Dale 2, making the game's prologue significantly more challenging and letting you skip some of the early fetch quests. I definitely don't recommend this mod for a first playthrough, as it's way too difficult for regular players. Although I liked that it introduced the prologue boss earlier on, there's also an optional component that makes the start of Chapter 1 more difficult, if you're a complete masochist. Of course, if you are looking for more challenging battles, there's a special version of the Tactics mod just for Icewind Dale 2. And if you liked the Companion NPC mod from Icewind Dale, you'll be pleased to know there's also one for the sequel, this time with 10 characters available to join your party. These NPCs come with unique portraits and voice packs, and will banter with each other and chat to the party leader.
This better be exciting.
A few of them are even open to being romanced by male or female player characters. This is a great option for people who missed the colourful cast of the Baldur's Gate series, although be aware that this is of course a fan project, and is inspired by companions from Dragon Age and Knights of the Old Republic, so there are some adult situations here, and some people might find the tone of the writing a little bit BioWarean, so to speak. Of course, it's not like vanilla Icewind Dale 2 is light on sexual content.
Planted a black seed in her womb.
Return them to the hand to serve as breeders.
Captured and seeded the female villagers.
You'd be forgiven for assuming that the Icewind Dale 2 modding scene was no longer active, but that's not the case. Maybe the biggest news to come out of the community was last year's closed beta release of the Icewind Dale 2 Enhanced Edition. This is completely unrelated to Beamdog's enhanced editions of the classic games. It's a very ambitious fan mod with a dizzying list of changes to the vanilla game. There are new items, spells, abilities, a higher level cap, redesigned enemies, recruitable NPCs, a fan-patched version of the original executable for better performance, and breaking open previously hard-coded features, and so much more. I haven't applied for the closed beta because the project is updated with new features so fast that by the time I played any significant amount of content, this part of the video would already be outdated. I do have some reservations about how all these changes are going to come together in the end product. I don't know how easy it'll be to balance attacks of opportunity when support characters like mages are already pretty vulnerable. And I'm not sure how much of a difference it'll make to replace a lot of the game's puzzles with more combat. In any case, many of these new features will be modular, so players can pick and choose what they want to install. Definitely a project to keep an eye on. With the release of the Icewind Dale Enhanced Edition in 2014, fans asked Beamdog about the chances of its sequel getting the same treatment. Over the years, the team have repeatedly poured cold water on the idea, pointing out that the game's source code appears to have been lost, and that the engine is so heavily modified compared to its cousins that reverse engineering it to be in line with their Infinity Next engine would be tremendously difficult. Last I checked, the Wizards of the Coast website was advertising the GOG version of Icewind Dale 2 as an enhanced edition, although this is probably just a misunderstanding due to all of the other games on the store being Beamdog's re-releases. Whilst everything Beamdog have said about Icewind Dale 2 is true, I seriously doubt they'd be as dismissive if the technological black sheep of the Infinity Engine games were Baldur's Gate 2 or Planescape Torment. The sad fact is, the original Icewind Dale never quite achieved the mainstream success of the Baldur's Gate franchise, and Icewind Dale 2 only clung to a fraction of that audience. From Beamdog's perspective, there's probably just very little financial incentive to put much work into resurrecting Icewind Dale 2. So anyone wanting to play the game in the future will just have to hope the community will maintain tools to ensure it works on newer operating systems. It's a shame the series passed away so quietly, but then the Icewind Dale series was always more a product of necessity than passion, meant to prevent Black Isle from capsizing over their failures with more ambitious projects. Still, that didn't stop the teams for both games giving their all in the hope of keeping fans entertained, and to this day the series has its die-hard enthusiasts. In 2015, Obsidian's Pillars of Eternity received a winter-themed expansion pack called the White March, but fans of this kind of experience will likely have to look further to the past than hope for the present, as the genre lost that sweet spot of balancing accessibility with classic dungeon crawling. Personally, I was never a huge fan of the Icewind Dale series' emphasis on combat, and it was Icewind Dale 2's attempt at expanding on the role-playing options that interested me. But the original game definitely comes together as the sum of its parts, whereas Icewind Dale 2 is a bit chewier. Replaying Icewind Dale 2's campaign was something I endured more than enjoyed, and it feels like it was balanced for the kind of player attracted to that experience. So, if you are the kind of player who likes to be put through the gauntlet, Icewind Dale 2 is probably for you. But more casual or roleplay oriented players might want to consider knocking the difficulty down a level in Chapter 1, or if you're solely interested in story and writing, maybe giving the game a pass.